Silverized Society.
Welcome back, one and all, to yet another Library Circus. This is the series where we break down the books that inform our perspective and our ideas on the movies we discuss. In this episode, we'll be breaking down one of probably the most difficult authors to break down their books, Carl Jung. And it's Justin that's read this book. So what exactly is the book that you read by Jung that we'll be discussing in this Library Circus? I just remembered that song is associated with circuses, so I got really excited to bring it into the pod.
Yeah, it's going to be Jung on Synchronicity and the Paranormal. That's the name of this book. Now, this is a part of a series called Encountering Jung. So it's excerpts from letters from his writings based all around a certain theme. And the theme of this one, it's a short book, 160 odd pages. The overall theme of this one is synchronicity and the paranormal.
That is exactly the kind of topics you want to cover on a podcast if you're looking to increase your credibility. So I'm really glad that we have, with what is this, the 5th episode of Library Circus, begun to dive into the paranormal and synchronicity, something that is, as of yet, not entirely defined, to me, at least. But I still talk about it anyway, because synchronicity is, well, I don't want to rush ahead, though, because do you want to tell us what topics we'll be talking about?
Yeah, I sure
From
do.
this book?
Sure. I also want to give you the word of the podcast, but in terms of topics,
well, let's keep it. Let's slow our roll here. We're so eager to get into the paranormal. You think we'll get pulled off of YouTube if we talk about the paranormal?
No, I think
is the vaccine paranormal? I want to be banned so that I don't have to work. Okay, go on.
Okay, so what did you even ask me? The word of the podcast. You're
the-
throwing me off now. I usually am trying to throw you off.
Are you in the paranormal?
Yeah, I am in the paranormal. What do you think? Look at me. What the fuck do you think?
That's true.
What the fuck do you think?
I'm asking silly questions.
You are. Okay.
I want to know what topics. So you said synchronicity and the paranormal, but are there smaller topics we'll be going into that we can expect?
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
I'm gonna give you
great.
I'm going to give you a little definition, a working definition of synchronicity. You're not going to understand it. I barely understand it. I'm going to give you a working definition of collective unconscious because we have to understand the other things. And then we're going to briefly float around several different topics. We'll talk about Jung's take on astrology, his take on parapsychology, and his take on UFOs, all briefly. And then that's about it. You know, well, I'll give you a little bit of background on why a eminent psychologist that people often reference dabbled in. I'd say beyond dabbled. I'd say beyond dabbling. That's what this should have actually been called. Beyond good and
dabbling.
That's what this should have been called. Beyond dabbling. He was really into a lot of topics that you might be surprised about. So
astrology surprises me.
Yeah, well. Get ready to be surprised more.
I love to be surprised.
Great. So let me...
That's why I do this podcast.
I'm going to surprise you with the word of the podcast. It's a noun.
It's not a surprise.
Umbra. 1590s. Phantom, ghost. A figurative use from Latin, umbra, shade, shadow. Astronomical sense of shadow cast by the earth or moon during an eclipse is first recorded in the 1670s. Meaning an uninvited guest accompanying Meaning an uninvited guest accompanying an invited one is from the 1690s in English. That's it. Umbra. Shadowy stuff.
Wow. That word sounds familiar to me as something else for some reason. I don't know why. I mean, not just umbrella.
Right. Think about umbrella, though. What does it do? It casts a shadow.
Cast a shadow.
So in other languages, you'll call it, see it called parasol, right? A parasol.
That's right.
That's against the
Yeah.
sun. But then you
a
have,
sun, the soul.
Yeah. So anyway, freestyle etymology. That's why you all come here.
That's what we do. That's what we do.
Umbrage, though.
All right.
I take umbrage with your interruptions. That's probably the word that is
oh, that's
you're
the one
thinking
I
of.
was thinking
Yeah.
of. Okay, well, take us along. Where are we starting first? Are we starting with some quotes? Because there are some quotes here. There are some quotes that I would like to go into. These quotes.
Oh, would you like to do it? You can read it if you like. That's why I made the notes.
Can I read them?
Please.
Okay, excellent.
You can read the
I'll start
first
with-
one. I'll read the second one.
Oh, okay. We'll start with one here because as I was looking over these notes, I myself was dabbling in the paranormal. I wrote a newsletter recently about curses because I was reading about some Greek myth and how one of the figures started to have this bad luck and thought, oh, have I been cursed? And I thought, what an interesting thought that is. Have I been cursed? You know, because that's something that is kind of falling out of our society if you're on the more, the less superstitious end and the more, materialist and rational and all that. The idea of curses, bad luck, all of that is just kind of seen as empty superstition. But I had this sense that maybe there's something more to that idea because, and this is what I wrote about in the newsletter though, is that, I think it doesn't have to be that it's materially true or something that a curse is true for it to have a kind of truth to it. I don't know, because if you think that you're cursed, right, you can start to act like you're cursed. And then you can actually start to cause yourself bad luck through the act of believing that you're going to have bad luck. So in a sense, there's this kind of like self-fulfilling curse. But when I saw this quote by Jung, it made me think, yes, I'm not crazy for looking into curses. There is something here. And this is why I love Jung, even though I'm not at all well read in Jung's work and versed in his ideas. I've always appreciated his willingness to step outside the realm of what is considered acceptable hard science. I think that that's what makes him such an interesting and bold and timeless thinker, is how willing he was to engage with both the hard rational sciences, but also to go into and explore areas that you don't have the ladders or the guide rails of hard science and all that to support your inquiries and investigations. And so in this quote, he says, "I shall not commit the fashionable stupidity of regarding everything I cannot explain as a fraud." I like that so much because that is, in a way, the essence of true curiosity. And this is what I think is the fatal flaw of the kind of dogmatic rationalism that's kind of pervading the West in some ways, is that everything that we don't immediately understand, or that we do understand in one capacity, like religion, for instance, because we see, okay, well, some of these stories aren't true, immediately discount them as all fictitious superstition that have no other role because of the lack of material truth or scientific truth. And now we see, well, perhaps actually that wasn't the only function, was whether they were scientifically accurate. And so this idea kind of gets to the root of why it's not always so productive to be almost dogmatic in your skepticism, which seems counterintuitive, but I think you can be that way.
Yeah, I don't think that people actually are very skeptical, but
no, I think it's different. I wouldn't say that people are very skeptical either per se, but I think it's more that people are very beholden to this kind of rationality. Not all people. This is more, a certain academic, intellectual subset of thinkers.
Yeah, I
like
just think
the new atheist kind of is a good example of that thinking, where if something can't be explained materially and rationally, then what is its use? And, well, maybe we just haven't been able to find that yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. The second quote, I think, is going to be what you're all going to need to understand in terms of what you're in store for with this podcast. And it's a quote from Carl Jung in a letter to somebody who I can't remember. There is only a faint possibility that you will find something of value in the maze of my thoughts, which I think is actually a good working slogan for the Silver Eye Society podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. The maze.
So I think what we need to do is I need to set you up with a brief bit of biography of Carl Jung, or an incident rather, from this book, which is going to which hit me really, really hard when I read it, because you need to understand, I think, this person's life experience. Where did this come from? This is from his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, 1963. I'll read to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the front doorbell began ringing frantically. It was a bright summer day. The two maids were in the kitchen, from which the open square outside the front door could be seen. Everyone immediately looked to see who was there, but there was no one in sight. I was sitting near the doorbell and not only heard it, but saw it moving. We all simply stared at one another. The atmosphere was thick, believe me, exclaimed. We all stared at each other. Then I knew that something had to happen. The whole house was filled as if there were a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep, right up to the door, and the air was so thick it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all a-quiver with the question, "For God's sake, what in the world is this?" Then they cried out in chorus, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought." That is the beginning of the Septem Sermones. Okay, so if you didn't know that was something that one of the, if someone told you that story, you didn't, and they were just a common person. They said, "Look, I was sitting around the house one day, and the doorbell started ringing frantically, and everyone else around me noticed that. And then my house was invaded by crowds of spirits who told me, in a chorus, 'We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought.'" I'm the type of person, I'd listen to that story and I'd be interested in it, but I also would be like, okay, well, are they around you right now? Because if you see them now, maybe we should.
Yeah, I'd probably be like, "Hey, man, I don't have any cash. I gotta go."
Yeah, so
because I would think that this was a homeless person on like Venice Boulevard or whatever.
But that's not what's going on. I mean, this is Carl Jung.
It's not. It's Carl freaking Jung, and that's why we listen. So
now,
this is the thing, though, is that Jung had a lot of visions, right? So is this one of his visions?
Well,
that's what I've understood.
It's either a memory or a reflection or a dream, I suppose, given we titled the book. But look, so briefly, look, I just want to, and I'm not going to go through every one of these incidents, but he in this book, through letters and writings, he talks about several different things that he has seen, which we would all consider to be falling under the category of the paranormal. So he talks about objects that flew apart, and there was no apparent reason for it. He talks about prophetic dreams. He talks about experiencing some chapel, I think in Italy, with another person, and they were looking at a painting, and then months later or something realized that painting doesn't exist in the chapel, yet they both had the experience that they had witnessed it. He talks about ectoplasm. He believes that while he was in a seance that he saw ectoplasm. And you understand basically what that is. That's the stuff from like 19th century spiritualist seance type things. There's like energy flying out of people's faces. So everyone needs to understand that, like, look, and he writes about this. I don't want to characterize him as a kook, because he writes about this in a very compelling way, and he goes through and explains all these different reasons for why the experience may have occurred and may not have occurred, and he's skeptical about it. But that's where we're at. So this is a person who that's the wavelength you need to be on as we go through some of these topics. So
the thing that's interesting to me about Jung is that I like, It really is one of these things. If you had picked up this book, you'd think, and you didn't know who Jung was, you'd think this is something from some new age shop selling crystals in, Santa Monica or something. And you just kind of write it off and be like, yeah, we know. Okay, you're seeing spirits. But the weird thing is that Jung is in so many ways such a credible and rigorous thinker. And he has been able to mostly withstand his reputation has been able to withstand what would otherwise kind of be these terribly discrediting and damning confessions and inquiries even. And I think that's a testament to how much he has proved himself as an insightful and clear thinker. It's not this kind, because there's a way. Look, the interesting thing here is that, okay, so like the idea of visions, my mom and my grandma have always been vision seeing people. My mom specifically has always felt that she's had premonitions in dreams, and she'd always keep a journal of dreams, and she's had dreams that she has said that have later come true. I think she even had a dream that she said she had some kind of premonition of 9/11, which is weird because she's not really this type of like, I'm having political dreams or something. It's completely strange. And she had some dream about, towers and blowing up, something like that. It wasn't exact, but that's usually how those things go. And so I've never really taken it very seriously, because I just don't. I don't take those things very seriously because I actually am more towards the overly rational, materialist side. Especially when I was younger and I first started moving away from religion, I was a very traditional new atheist that was like, religion is just a fake story and it's useless. And if we got rid of it, things would be better because people would be logical. Oops, that turned out to be wrong. And it's wrong in the way that I think rationalism can get things wrong. And we spoke about this briefly in the Jacob's Ladder episode that we did, where we spoke about how there is, how intellect itself is not this kind of all-encompassing virtue, and that there are other forms of understanding in the world, and intellect can only get you in some directions. And it's useful and it's great. But I mean, the other thing with that is that you have to understand that intellect can be used for malicious purposes. There are think of the evil genius type of figure. So I think that it's a little bit arrogant, and that's what I would say. What my problem was when I was first grasping onto this hyper-rational, materialist worldview and discounting everything that I couldn't immediately prove or see type of thing, was that it was a kind of arrogance, which is all that stuff is old superstition. People didn't have the tools or the understanding, and so they made up stories. And if you can't explain it and you can't understand it, then it's probably not real. But I think that that's arrogant because especially I was like a teenager when I had that view, and teenagers are known for their incredible mixture of idealism, arrogance, and naivety. And so I think that when I look at the ideas that Jung puts forth, and it's so interesting because more and more I'm moving away from the idea of just rationality itself as being the answer to all human ills. And Jung's work has started to become more interesting to me, particularly the idea of synchronicity and mainly synchronicity. But the visions is an interesting thing. I think we discount that as like, oh, you're just a crazy person, or oh, you just want attention or something. And it's not that that's not sometimes true, but I think with Jung, it would be silly to think that that's what it is, Yeah,
I don't think that's what it is at all. So as always, and with many of our podcasts, we could go on for quite a long time on the topic just of visions, but I want to use this episode as kind of just an overview of a glancing across some of these issues, and we'll probably return to some of them again. Partially, I'm always, when we're reading these books and doing the book episodes, I'm trying to find connections to the films that we watch. But I think we should move to the idea of synchronicity now. And I want to say right now that I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to do my best. So if you wanted a simple, maybe working definition, it would be a meaningful, acausal coincidence. That's what he kind of sees synchronicity as. Now,
can I push on that?
Please.
Okay, so what's interesting to me about that definition is, meaningful but acausal. Acausal in the sense that it's not intentional, and this is this is important because I was thinking about this recently, because I feel like I've been noticing this concept of synchronicity in my own life, and how to get into this without sounding like I'm becoming a new age person, which it's not that, because my understanding of the idea of acausal is that, okay, here's how I understand synchronicity.
Do you want?
What are you giving me signs for?
Well, I was saying, do you want to go with your? Should I give a very brief story from this to explain it? Actually, I'd rather hear what you think it is first.
Okay, yeah. Because here's the thing. So I see, acausal, yet meaningful, yet coincidental. Okay. So what I've noticed recently in my life is things that have occurred that are random, that are not in somehow being perpetuated with some intention behind them, but that convey a meaning to me and that have happened repeatedly, enough to draw my attention to the possibility that there is some greater meaning or, I don't know, goal that these instances are pointing to. Let me see if I can give an example. I hate to be too personal, but okay, whatever. I can't think of anything else, so I guess I have to tell the truth. But recently I've had several people randomly ask me about my relationship status in kind of a caring and interested way that's very odd. For one person, it was very random. For another person, it made a little more sense, but this happened before the second person did it. And it happened fairly close together. And these people don't know each other, and there's no other seemingly stimulus for why this should happen, meaning I didn't post something online saying I'm going through it or something. It seems that there's no stimulus, that it was their own organic choices to bring up this topic. And there had also, it started to make me point in the direction of, this is how I interpret synchronicity for myself, at least, as something useful that can be used in one's life, which is there may be something that you're ignoring or that you don't realize. And these things that happen can be, in a way, hints of what you don't notice yet.
So, obviously, the rational explanation would be you're a girl on the internet and you have a somewhat public, you're out there doing stuff, whatever, So it's not that weird that maybe someone would ask you what your relationship status is. Now, whether or not that's the case or not, it doesn't really in some sense, I'm not even sure if it matters, because it's your recognition of this thing, which then gives insight into something that perhaps you're thinking about. However, I'm not paid enough to do analytical psychology here, nor am I qualified. So let me give you a story about that I think demonstrates this well from the book. Jung was with a client, and the client was talking about a dream she had about a scarab, which is a type of Egyptian beetle. While that happened, he heard something tapping at the window. And he went to the window and looked out, and it was a beetle. And he took the beetle and he brought it to his client and gave it to her. Now, what is this? Well, that event somehow led to some sort of kind of breakthrough for his client, number one. It allowed her, it was meaningful to her, the event, okay? It was acausal in this sense. The beetle, beetling around out there outside, didn't know about the dream that this person had had, because beetles probably don't interpret dreams. Speculation. And but showed up there at that particular time. Okay? So we have something that's acausal. In other words, in Jung's conception of this, the client's dream did not influence the movement of the beetle, and the beetle's movement did not influence the client's dream, because the client's dream had happened previous anyway, though that gets into some things about his notion of relativity of time and relativity of space and the psyche, which we're not going to delve into right now. But anyway, you see it's acausal, right? You see that it's meaningful to the client. Whether or not it was meaningful to the beetle, no one knows. And it was a coincidence. So that is the best example of what I can give in terms of synchronicity.
Mm-hmm.
Should we delve further into that? I think that we need to, we're going to have to leave it at that. And that's going to be enough to kind of get us through some of the other stuff, because we can do an app. I actually can't right now, but I
think we're not doing synchronicity justice. Look,
it's not meant to be done justice right now. Do you understand? Do you need to go on to another topic right now, or can we go into synchronicity slightly more? Go ahead and see.
Because synchronicity is probably the more important thing to me personally right now.
Then go ahead.
Because so here's synchronicity is a great example of not using intellect per se, and being able to know things or gain information that can be useful without relying on rationality. And so I think synchronicity is the perfect example of. It's interesting because I see myself taking this opposite pattern, right? Because when I was younger, the whole thing was astrology and witchcraft and New Age, and that was when, you got into all that stuff. And as you get older, you kind of leave those things behind and become rational. But I find myself on the opposite trajectory. Not that I'm doing witchcraft or anything, but it's interesting because while I was more hyper rational when I was younger, now it's like I've learned that there are limits to that. And again, I come back to the Jacob's Ladder episode, because that whole movie puts forth that idea that there are limits to where you can go with rationality. It's the clueless professor character. And so synchronicity, I think, is such an it's a really beautiful idea, though, is the thing, because it's very poetic. And here's the thing that I think it's like, so is poetry rational? Is poetry always logic? Is art rational? Isn't art in its own way of knowing, in a way that transcends the rational and the logical? I mean, you can have art that's entirely that's surreal, that makes no clear sense, and yet it can make deep sense, and it can help a person. And so I think that's this idea that there are things beyond the rational. You have anything with that?
I would say that everyone knows there are things beyond the rational. And I think almost everyone experiences them. I really do.
But they're so shamed.
Correct.
It's such a thing that it's like you can damage your credibility by speaking about these things. You can easily become more and more. The more these things start to pull my attention, and the more I start to be aware that there's clearly devastating limitations to relying solely on rationality and intellect, and believing that these are the only tools that are useful for navigating the world. And yet at the same time, I start to feel more that there is a danger in stepping outside of those things, because it's almost like there's this kind of sense of taboo about that.
It's not,
or it can discredit you,
So yes, but that's the minor danger, because if you take these things seriously and you start to step out of rationality, then you better fucking buckle up, because there's implications. And so look, yeah, I wouldn't go. I think you You're more concerned about this idea of like, if I say I like crystal skulls, people will think I'm a fool. True.
Well, no, on the contrary.
I'm not saying
like,
you personally.
It's not even.
I'm not saying you personally.
No, well, I mean, isn't there like a massive industry of selling crystals also? So it's, in a way, it's like you could probably be fine embracing those things, but this goes beyond that. This is not crystals also. This is why I think like, because you can be in the realm of crystals and mantras and shit and be just totally fine and like open $1 million business on, Santa Monica or something. But we're talking about here, what Jung gets to is way deeper than that. And that's why you say it's destabilizing and dangerous. It
can be. I think that you need to be able to, I'm not going to give advice to anybody. Look, what I'm saying is that, let me put it this way, okay? You can look at synchronicity in a bunch of different ways, but let me get a little farther down to the root of what he's talking about. And then let me try to show that if you were to take this seriously, the way in which you exist would be different. He believes, and this is going to reach into the I Ching and astrology to some degree also, getting ahead, but we're just going to meld it. So he believes causality itself is a Western invention. The idea that you know what causality is, you think you know what causality is, but actually when you start to explore it, it gets linked up to ideas of intention, and then you try to locate intention within the human mind, and it gets very complex. But we all have a working idea of what causality is. He says that the Eastern mindset, so in particular with the I Ching, and this is where all these things, I didn't even get to the collective unconscious yet. This is where this all kind of comes together, which is why it's a bit of a struggle to explain this. That the notion of causality being a Western invention, and a relatively recent one. If you go before that in Western thought, you have the notion of the sympathy of all things. I don't know if you're aware of that idea. I think you're probably vaguely aware of it, right? So now we're getting into alchemy. We're getting into as above, so below, macrocosm, microcosm, a lot of deep concepts.
The sympathy of all things.
Yeah, the sympathy of all things.
There's a similar sounding idea that's Japanese, mono no aware, I think, and it's the pathos of all things, I think, is a translation. And it's the idea, but it's more related to kind of like this sympathetic relation to the world as inherently transient and beautiful in its transience. So I don't know if it's related.
The
sympathy of all things.
Yeah, so this is an older idea. This is not sympathy as in, oh, you stubbed your toe and I feel bad for you. This is magic in essence. The people who so those who understand it previous to the Enlightenment, those who explored it, the basis of Western magic and esotericism, one branch of it is within the notion of the sympathy of all things, because it means that you can control things at a distance via ritual. Again, we're getting real deep here, and then it's hard to skirt over these things. But what I'm trying to get at, to bring it back to synchronicity, is that he sees the world we live in, where we talk about and think about causality. He sees that as actually a fairly recent thing, coming from maybe the 1700s, and he sees in the Eastern mindset a different viewpoint, which relates somewhat to an older Western mindset that is the sympathy of all things.
So is this kind of something that is, in a way, contradicting the scientific revolution? Not per se contradicting, but I mean, like, we're contrasting two perspectives on the world, essentially. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at when I say, like, this hyper-rational Western view is, so there was this scientific revolution, and it was a revolution about how we viewed everything, because now we were able to give causality, right? which was now we can see things. We have microscopes. We can see that, oh, you don't get sick because you were cursed. You get sick because you ingested a virus or something like this. And so I think that's probably where the idea of causality becomes so strong from, because now you're suddenly able to set up that timeline and prove when, the control of the experiment that says, let's see if this thing causes this thing by isolating things and all of that. And not to say that, no science or something, but I think there's something lost in viewing the scientific revolution and the understanding of the world that came out of that as the only thing, the one truth. Because even that process, it's a process, it's a tool, it's another method of seeing and understanding, right? And so what we're talking about now that Jung touches on is what was there before? What are the other ways of understanding? And is it flawed to think that just because those other ways were flawed too and make mistakes, that they are inherently 100% useless and wrong? And again, this comes back to the idea of, is religion inherently 100% useless and wrong just because science and that perspective that comes out of science shows that, well, a lot of the things that were believed through religion are disproven. But yet, we see that there are other elements to it that couldn't really easily be put under a microscope or disproven with carbon dating or something like that, that still had important functions, like the hope, belief, a system of values for acting. Those aren't things that easily come to view through the scientific method, So I think that's what's important to understand when we talk about these things, is that, again, I think maybe it's useful also to bring this down to a microcosmic example, which is, if you have two ideas, it's not that so this idea is more useful to me, so the other one is completely useless, I throw it away, get rid of it, and it's disgusting to even talk or look at. Maybe you can look at both of the ideas and being able to examine them both, even if you rely on another one more, still adds value to you as a person and the way that you understand things. That's why I like these ideas, because even though synchronicity isn't something that we can talk about, it's been proven with science, I think it still provides value to consider.
I agree with you. I think it's interesting. I think that it is valuable. I think that something he writes in this book is, I have to remind myself, the last witch in Europe was burned the year my grandfather was born. Now,
So strange.
I would remind people that it was in the late 18th century, maybe, when doctors realized they should wash their hands before they perform surgery. So I'm not here to sell you crystals or downplay the scientific revolution or logic or reason or anything like that. I agree with you. Those are very useful tools and can even act as a kind of, people always take the scientific viewpoint and they pretend like it's the viewpoint of a kind of almost stoic or, the tough viewpoint to have. I'm very reasonable. Mm-hmm. But what the trick is, what people often do with it is they use it just as much as a narcotic as other people use crystal therapy. They'll play that trick on themselves, and I understand why people do it, and I'm not criticizing them.
It provides a sense of stability also, which is the same thing, I think, in a way. I think so. Here's that intention, right? That importance of intellect is a tool. A tool can be used with the wrong intention. So science is great and extremely useful in the scientific process, and that kind of rational outlook is obviously incredibly useful. But if it becomes a shield or something you kind of use to hide yourself and to immediately fight off anything that might shake up the fact that even science can't answer everything just yet, then perhaps you're not even using science in the way that it's meant to be used, you know? And I think this touches a little bit on what has culturally come out now, which is this ethos of believe science. You know, where it's become this cultural battlefield, whether you believe science or you're anti-science. And you can kind of see that really shows you that there is a way to even take something that's supposed to be dry and apathetic and neutral and rational and turn it into its own kind of belief system.
Yeah. I'm not, slogans are slogans, and they're useful for some people and useless for others, and they're useless for me. So when people talk about that, I just think, do you even know what science is? I mean, it's
a silly phrase because it's almost like it's contradictory. It's inherently contradictory. You don't believe science. It's a process. If you were believing it, then you're not doing the process. So anyway, let's go on though, because I think you're about to talk about collective unconscious.
Oh boy.
Collective unconscious I'm not super familiar with it, but I do find it's one of the first ideas I think I encountered with Jung that drew me in, because shall I give you my naive understanding of it?
Yeah.
And then you can correct me as a way to segue into it?
Sure. My correction is probably not going to be that great. I mean,
I think I have a little bit of a, because I don't know.
How would you define it in one sentence or two sentences?
Okay, if I can do that with anything, sure. Collective unconscious is, to me, at least, the way I understand it, is some kind of understanding that is almost inherent in the human experience, and thus it's collective, but it's not something that we have to learn or be taught. And that's what makes it unconscious, is that it's almost like part of being human. I think there's an example, though. It's like, well, if a human was raised outside of human society, would they still have the collective unconscious? Though I think that, I can't remember where I got that idea from, if it was Jung or if it was my own or whatever. But the idea is that even a human that's raised away from human beings would still have this symbolism or this framework in a way for navigating the world, and whether that be a hero archetype. His archetypes are part of the collective unconscious, and so I mean that would be the idea, is that even still a human still can have those figures for understanding the world, or that framework, without being taught or being part of a human civilization.
Yeah. That's, I think, about right. So you want to think of it maybe, and again, this is, I didn't go into this hardcore. I'm really just starting with Carl Jung in a lot of ways. I read one other book previous to this a bit ago, but
yeah, he's very hard to read, and it's very dense, and it's I think that the topics can be so challenging that it's hard to speak about in any loose way without feeling like you're running astray, or
Well, I'm going to freestyle it. So collective unconscious would be maybe the set of images, visions, archetypes, symbols that are inherent to human beings and that span all cultures, and that are mainly and largely inaccessible to the conscious mind, though and I think that we'll skip this part, but there's a part about the difference between spirit and soul, and problems with that and psychology. So it is this collection of images, symbols, archetypes, I believe, are within there that is across all cultures, and that is inherent to being a human being. Now, here's what I started to think when I started to think about that. I wondered if it evolves because some of the things he talks about, that was my question. Has it evolved over time, or are the contents of the collective unconscious changing? And granted, it would be changing over large time spans. And then also I wondered if there is a collective unconscious for other living beings. So is there a collective unconscious for sharks? And what would that look like? And I think that if it's real and if it's true, there's a bunch of really weird things that happen from this. They're very, very strange. First, I think that if somehow you were able to go back in time to very early human beings and take a snapshot of what the collective unconscious looked like at that moment, you would, and then move up to where we are now, take a snapshot of that and compare it. The question, well, I'll phrase it as a question, would there be changes? And I say if there would be changes, then to look too far backwards would almost be so horrifying it would be impossible to comprehend. Because what are the collective dreams of a human being that existed 100,000 years ago in an environment that's so brutal that has nothing to do with our modern life? Or more, your face trying to listen
I'm in pain.
This. And then potentially more disturbing, what if it hasn't changed much and that those images from human beings 200,000 years ago are still here with us? But I see, as I was reading this and I was trying to speculate on it and think about it, because he does say, now, so briefly, what he says is this. Most of the parapsychological types of things like spirits and seances and stuff like that, that's actually a manifestation of something more simple. That is, okay, so let's tie this into movies. And so you see this as a constant theme in movies about exorcism and about poltergeist. It's often a young woman in a house, and then spoons start flying around everywhere or whatever, right? That's usually, if you look at almost every exorcism movie, it's also a female. So let's put that aside for a second. But he says that those things are generally actually just conscious things, the older Freudian idea of repression. So this person has repressed something from their conscious and pushed it down, and now it's bubbling back up, and the spoons are flying around everywhere, okay? That's something we all kind of can get our heads around, right? Now, he says there's another thing that can happen. It's real squirrely. If images from the collective unconscious, and try to think of an up and down thing, okay? So up here is your consciousness. You're walking around doing whatever. Down here is repressed memories and things like that people go to therapy for and deal with, right? And then down here also is the collective unconscious, even farther down if we wanted to do a kind of spatial type thing. My question was, number one, is there a connection? Do these things bump up against each other ever? Because as he says, there certainly is a route upwards from the collective unconscious, the images of the collective unconscious. And what happens when that happens is bad, usually. It's either what we would consider like severe mental illness, people going really off the rails. Or he says sometimes that the images from the collective unconscious come up through creative genius briefly, and also when there is a time, when there is an age shift. And this gets really complicated. So when it is time for a culture to completely change, then you're going to need images from the collective unconscious moving up into the consciousness, but it's always a very risky endeavor. This ties into ideas of astrology, ideas of the age of Pisces switching to the age of Aquarius, and the idea of Pisces, the astrological house of Pisces being related to Jesus Christ and the mediator between heaven and earth. So
not Jesus Christ.
Jesus Christ. Do you see why I was like, Do you
Oh my
understand now
God,
why
dude.
before we started the podcast I was like, this is going to be...
Yeah, now I understand. I
Okay.
thought you were gonna make some like crazy confessional or something, but now I understand it's worse.
What am I going to do? What am I going to do?
I don't know.
I was going to
don't know.
announce my crystal shop on GeoCities.
Oh, that would have been more benign.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Fuck. Okay. It's heavy shit, man. That's the thing. Look, and this is why I think that people get edgy when you try to talk about this stuff, because it's like you said, what are you going to do with this idea that everything you know in the framework of the world is completely wrong? Or at least here's what I bet. Here's what I bet. Let's get real fucking crazy. Who cares? I bet, like, and it's not that I don't think science is real and all that shit. Obviously it's real. I have a degree in science. Like, I fucking studied it. I agree with it. I use it. But I bet that that's like a superficial layer for navigating a superficial world, and that there's a deeper level of understanding to the world that is beyond that type of neat system. Because wouldn't science be great? Wouldn't it be great if science could just answer all of our problems and that was the framework for the world and that was it and it's all laid to rest now and we figured it out? Clearly that's not what it is, though, because we still have lots of human problems, and it's not like you can just go to the science center and be healed of your problems, you know? So I bet that, and it is clear that you know, scientific thinking and that process has alleviated so many problems and allowed for society and civilization to progress in incredibly amazing ways. But I think that there are these deeper, murkier, more opaque issues that cannot be put to the test in a lab. And I mean, first of all, there are things that are simple that you cannot test in a lab. There are experiments that you can't even do because you can't isolate enough variables. You know, like you can't test certain things about a human being because every human being is unique, and because there are all these different influences that can spoil an experiment and make it, you know, not entirely controlled. So there are absolutely, undoubtedly, places that science cannot reach. So to deny that even is just to deny, to not even understand what science is at that point. I mean, that's one of the first things you learn is the limitations of an experiment, of the scientific method. And so this, when we talk about these kind of deeper ideas, like the collective unconscious, it's hard to parse. I mean, it's hard because what do you even do with an idea like that? I mean, what I think is that I like the idea you bring up of whether what really started to get me uncomfortable was the idea that does the collective unconscious change, and what would be these symbols and this framework for understanding for like Neanderthals or something,
so
compared to us.
He doesn't in this book talk about that. That was just my thought about a particular passage, because there was this, and I was trying to explain it with these levels. I actually did this weird drawing trying to figure out in my mind.
You have to start doing that kind of weird like things when you're reading this stuff,
because it's this question of essentially thinking of like the conscious up here, and then these two chambers underneath the surface level, one of being repressed and memories, thoughts, whatever, the stuff we'd normally consider, if not mental illness, a problem that would be solved through psychotherapy, right? But then this other chamber over here, that's something that is what he calls a... And so what I was trying to figure out is, if repressed memories and things we can visualize as descending from the conscious, right? Conscious. On their journey in the descent, wouldn't they brush up against the archetypes that also are living below the surface? And wouldn't this, then this is the really disturbing idea I had, which, you know, let's do it. I write horror stuff.
Yeah, let's do it.
If it is via a descent of repressed memories and thoughts, which are usually things that have gone wrong, if it's through that conduit in which that brushes up against the archetypal images, then wouldn't that be the method in which slowly those archetypal images change over time. And that means that's a history. That means that potentially those images are a history of trauma that is 1,000,000 years old, at least partially.
Okay, wait a minute. Okay. Okay. So can I phrase it in a way that maybe makes sense to me and then go from there?
Yeah, sure.
Is there a collective unconscious trauma? A history, like a shared history of tragedy or something? Like, or are you saying that it is the same pathway that trauma and repression and all of that shit is exercised, is also the pathway that these collective unconscious imagery, however you want to, throughout human history, are also brought out? It's the same road?
Again, I'm just speculating. I'm just a person that's read it.
Yes, we're all speculating. Yeah. This entire podcast is speculating. We cannot anymore because I'm trying to understand what we're talking about. Okay. And I hate that we have to constantly be like, guys, you know.
No, I know. Yeah, sure.
That,
I just don't want to.
I can't.
I don't want to have read a 150-page book and then start being like, this is my theory about it. So, but I'm going to do it anyway. So,
I mean, it is your theory. Yeah. So,
but it actually may already be because I haven't read all of his work. He may have already talked about this, and I could simply be either saying something he's already said or something that a critic said. I don't know. But anyway, this was just one thought about it. And yes,
unfortunately for our listeners, this is not the eminent Jung scholar podcast. So please bear with us. Here is your warning.
I'm going to start a Jung podcast. I'm going to call it Young Jeezy.
And then what you're gonna do the whole time is being like, I'm just speculating.
Listen,
this may be.
Okay, so
I know you like to be careful, but let it rip.
So what I'm trying to say is that, maybe over here in the archetypes and the collective unconscious, maybe that is separate. That it never brushes up against. Just because spatially I'm analogizing between the conscious mind up here and then repressed thoughts and memories down here below, which seems to indicate a proximity to the archetypal images in the collective unconscious. That does not mean, number one, that they are adjacent. It doesn't mean that they are intertwined. It doesn't mean any of that. All I was trying to say is that is it perhaps a possibility that over millions of years of human history that this is the mechanism if the collective unconscious does change at all through time, which he does not say. And in fact, given the fact that he thinks that a lot of this stuff, he uses relativity and he uses quantum physics in a way which I don't exactly, which later the New Age has a problem with, because it fucking takes every quantum mechanics thing. It's like, oh, it's magic, and they're wrong. And he's, God bless him, at least writing in the 1950s, where a lot of this stuff is fairly new and all that. But he does make some big jumps, and he uses it to say that my head's going to explode on the podcast, that space and time may be relative within the confines of what he calls this collective unconscious, which is a kind of psyche apart but common to all of humanity, which is why I needed to explain synchronicity also, because we see again this theme. To him, causality isn't really here. Or exactly. But what he did, but the problem is that when anyone deals with quantum mechanics, they do this thing and they say, well, did you know about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle? And isn't that crazy? That means that I can control the weather with my mind. No, because the things that occur on a quantum level, a lot of the difficulties in measurement and a lot of the difficulties in perception is because it's on such a small level that you're using small particles to measure. And within that measurement that's why when you shoot a photon at something else to see where it's at, you move the thing that you just shot it at because it's so small. If I shoot a photon at the wall's real big. It's not going to move it in any major way in which would mess up the experiment. So people have this problem, and it's in a lot of stupid documentaries where they're like, quantum mechanics means everything. It doesn't mean everything. That's crystal skull shit. That's not real. This is not real. But that being said, I'm not totally downing what he's saying here because that's not what he's saying. He's not saying that. However, he does. For instance, one of the big themes in this book that comes up, and he writes letters to him, is an early experiment on what we would call ESP that is actually kind of famous, and you'll probably have seen it culturally from the Ghostbusters movie, the original, in which they're doing these. They have these cards, and there are symbols on the back of them. And this is a person called, I think, something Rhine or something like that. You can look it up. It's actually very interesting because one of the first meta-analysis ever done was done on his work. Side point. Anyway. So this is you got cards, okay? And like let's say we're doing it right now. I'd have these cards and one would have a circle, triangle, square, whatever, some other shit on a star. And I'd be like, "Which card is this?" And you'd be like, I'm doing ESP, and you'd say star. So and I'd be like, "Yeah, you're right. It's real." So now to be fair, this guy did a lot of this Rhine guy. And there's criticisms about his methods and all of that, which probably are valid. I don't know. I'm not trying to say that I think this is real. Jung thinks it's real. All right. But whether or not it's real or not doesn't even really matter to me. The reasons he theorizes why it's real are really interesting. Anyway, I don't know. I just went off on a major tangent.
Are you going to tell us the reasons?
The reasons of what?
Why he theorizes why it's real?
Are we at that part? Yeah, we'll just be at that part. This is parapsychology.
Yeah.
Okay. So.
Yeah. So we're talking about ESP.
Yeah. Let's just say
now.
Let's talk about that.
Okay, that's like the thing that can you define that a little bit for me because I don't really
extrasensory perception. I think is what it is, right? But
so what, like a sixth sense?
It would
is
be
that
like
kind of the idea.
You'd be like guess a number between 1 and 10, and then I keep getting the right answer over and over. And but it's psychic. It's the idea of a psychic, right?
Okay, yeah,
that's all it is.
Yeah,
and if you've ever seen, I think the old Ghostbusters movie has.
Yes, they have a part with that.
It is
making fun of it though.
It is that experiment. It is based on my guess. It's a guess. I don't know for sure. My guess is they knew about this experiment. This happened at Duke University, I want to say, or somewhere in Carolinas. I don't know. A real university. This guy was like, Jung thinks that parapsychology is a branch of psychology. So let's get that first out of the way. He thinks, and he is skeptical about it sometimes, and he doesn't just like, yeah, it's totally real. But number one, he thinks that the more focused and positive mood, the more focused attention and positive mood of the practitioner of ESP will tend to influence the outcome favorably. And he does this by looking statistically, because this guy did a lot of cards and a lot of people doing this, right? And he saw, supposedly, that people tended to do better at guessing the cards and demonstrating what he thought of as ESP the earlier on they did it. You know what we should do? We should just release this episode for a Halloween episode. That's what it should be. Another side note. Anyway, so there's that, number one, which is interesting in and of itself, that he thinks attention and the mood of the practitioner influences the outcome. He also thinks, again, that, how should I explain this? They actually did this during the experiment. They moved the person to a different building. So the person hiding the cards, the investigator or whatever you want to call him, the scientist, they said, well, what if it's proximity? What if there's a tell? So, in gambling and poker, you give tells, right? So like, ultimately people could pick up on the facial thing and
eyebrow raise, whatever, some little tick like that. Yeah.
Right. So good idea they did. So they moved this person over to a different location. And I don't know the answers. I didn't look into all this data. I know there's a lot of critiques of it. Probably it could not be real. I don't know. I'm telling you what Jung thought at the time. He said, well, that's not going to matter. And it proved out that it's fine because this, forget about the actual experimental cleanliness of it. Space and time won't have any consideration for this anyway. That the psychic ability won't be bound to how you could be 5,000 miles away or you could be right next door. It doesn't matter. Which gets into some other crazy stuff like remote viewing and all that. We're not going to do that. But anyway, no. So that's where he's at on ESP. That's where he's at on and a lot of this stuff. But it's because he thinks that this deeper part of our psyche is not bound by time and space. He's not bound by the rules of Newtonian physics and time and space. I can't prove him wrong. I don't think he has proved him right. I mean, I don't know. But that's why I'm just trying to give people an idea of what this is all about and trying to tie it into Ghostbusters. In case you see that, then you got some trivia you can talk about.
Yeah, that's right. Wow. Heavy. I mean, it's... Whew. I don't even know. I don't have anything to add to that. I definitely don't have anything to add to this. I just think it's all interesting to consider because it really is. It's really, there's something valuable in being open to the unknown, right? Because in a way, this is what it is simply what we don't know, what we can't. I guess it's in some ways, it's also the idea of like God or something, right? Because can you truly ever be an atheist or can you only simply be an agnostic? Which is, I can't prove it's there, but I can't prove it's not there either. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
And I think that that's kind of like a useful way to deal with things that are traditionally viewed as debunked, discredited, discrediting, to even consider is that it's worth considering what's unknown or what we can't know.
So I'm very wary of giving advice, so I'm just not going to do it. Let me tell you though.
You should probably just stop saying beforehand, I'm not going to give you advice.
Well, because it's my way of saying, but I'm about to say something but I vaguely think it's just a way of indemnifying me against people buy the wrong crystal off my GeoCity shop.
Yeah.
I think, and then let's touch on astrology very briefly, and we'll do it. And I'm going to make this point using that. So I think that these systems, these ways of thinking, I think that they can be, if nothing else, let's say, that they could potentially be useful to gain insight into your own mind. If dealt with responsibly, I guess would be my best way, and with some knowledge and with some foundation to... It's kind of like this, man. It's kind of like this. It's the same thing with, like, let's say psychedelic drugs. Not everybody ought to be doing that. And almost everyone at certain times in their life shouldn't be doing that. You got to go into certain things. When you're going out on the margins, you need to be hydrated and you need to be stable and you need to be grounded to some degree. So if you,
it's like the sirens. It's like the sirens. The story of who is this? Odysseus? Mm-hmm. It was Odysseus that they tied him to the mast. So this is important because I think this is the same thing. It's the same thing with creative work, right? Which Jung thinks is also actually, if you're really getting into some deep world-changing shit, that you may be tapping into this collective unconscious is one of his ideas. So it's that same idea that there's an inherent kind of risk to messing around in the depths, in the darkness, in the unknown. And I think the story of Odysseus kind of exemplifies that idea that you better be secure or you're going over the edge. And it's the same thing with psychedelics. And it's the same thing with, I guess, with these kind of world shattering ideas, because what do you do with a world where if you upend your entire framework for it and you say, here's my world, and you toss that out, and now you have opened up a whole cavern underneath what you thought you were standing on. And so that's not it's something to be dealt with responsibly, because any idea that can be so expansive can become a void, can become a kind of crutch or something. And you see that with a lot of like when the new age stuff gets just kind of like watered down and warped, it just becomes a pacifier or some kind of a crutch that people rely on, which is just the same thing with anything, same thing with any idea. It becomes something we use to stabilize ourselves against the inherent unpredictability of the world. And a lot of people need that. But you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that helps you instead of hurts you and others.
I think that the safest bet is actually just to use it like that. Because again, I'm saying that if you take some of these ideas absolutely seriously, the ramifications for it, it's kind of hard to calculate, isn't it? I mean, if you really operated in a world in which you thought that there is no causality and that, do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's almost.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what I would do. I don't know actually even how to live outside that framework.
Right, and I'm not sure that it should be lived in, except for by certain people who are attuned and prepared to do that, and by people at certain times in their life. That's all I'm trying to say. And I think it's also important to say, if you find yourself looking into the abyss, you might ask yourself why you ended up looking in the first place. So I just think that because in my life, I've seen people that have gone out too far and they didn't come back all the way. I've seen that before.
We've all seen that. I think if we admit.
Yeah. And that's all I'm saying. And I'm not saying, look, this book isn't going to, you're safe. It's a safe space. You can do this.
Gonna read the book and come up with, empty eyes and never be the same.
No, and Library Circus is a safe place to explore these ideas. But that's all. I'm just saying, I feel like we all have seen people, whether it's whatever it is, that have been so there's a sadness to it because they've lacked meaning so much that they've gone so far out looking for it, and then they've got let me show you my crystal skull collection.
Yeah, something strange happens there, isn't it? Something strange happened there.
It's the real world ramification of a void of meaning. And people fuck around with this idea and people play around with it and talk about, I don't believe in anything. But you do, because if you didn't, if you really didn't,
you'd be a danger to either yourself or to others.
Yeah. So we've gone on a little longer than I thought.
UFOs.
Well, I didn't actually. Astrology is actually the most interesting. Part of it. I don't know.
Do we have time, or should we?
We could do a second. I wish we had feedback from people. Like if we knew that they enjoyed this, and we could just do a separate episode. Or
no, we should do a separate one because this is so heavy. Like what are you gonna do? Sit through 2 hours of us talking about ectoplasm and like warning you not to venture into the void too far? I mean, I would. That's why we're here. But we will not burden people yet because, you got to take the void in little doses. You got to microdose the void.
That's a good name.
That's how you know it's time to end.
That's a good name for the episode.
That actually is a good name for the episode. All right. Let's end it there because I think we've dabbled in the void long enough. And so... tune in to the next episode of Library Circus. I feel like we're leaving people with a...
Yeah. Actually, hold on. I'm going to do the outro. I have to take responsibility.
Let's wrap it up.
I have to take responsibility for this. This shouldn't be on your shoulders. let me flip this a bit and make it a little more positive, okay? Because I just sternly warned
we
people
ended on the darkest warning.
Don't go into the wilderness or you may never come back. So Carl Jung was a psychologist that tried to help people, and he tried to help people get better, and he did it using these ideas. So these ideas are not necessarily dangerous or harmful or whatever. They're actually extraordinarily interesting. They're potentially something that could help. I'm so bad at talking about help and like people getting better. I'm sorry. I'm trying my best. Okay. This
is good for you. You should do this.
In a non-linear universe, there is no sense of progress. Okay. So never mind.
No.
It's good. It's good. It's a good book.
That's the end. It's good.
It's good.
Get out of here. You can't. I'll do the nice ending. Okay.
Yeah, do it.
Here's the thing. Let's tie up with my favorite idea from here, which is synchronicity. So I think I'd like to return to that briefly. I think if you want to use these ideas and you find yourself compelled to engage with these kind of ideas that seem to be a little bit outside of the framework that we use generally in our society, can you please stop sending me secret signals while I'm trying to speak?
I'm doing it because I edit.
What's that?
That was when you said a little bit. I was making the gesture of a little bit because then I was going to edit it in as a fucking joke. You
I don't
understand.
read sign language.
Yeah, but just let me. This is.
So ignore you. You're telling me to ignore you.
Please,
okay.
God, everyone, just do.
I will. Anyway. So synchronicity, ideas like this, I find that they actually are enriching because they give you, there's something really exciting and energizing about understanding that you don't know everything. That's a beautiful fucking thing. It is actually incredibly inspiring and exciting to understand that you don't live in a fish tank where every rock has been turned over and everything is controlled and filtered and understood and explained. There is an element to life that we don't fully know. I mean, it's silly to think that we can know everything and that we can, with such expertise and such conviction, condemn every idea that doesn't fit in a framework that we've only had for a few centuries. So I think that it's not that you should pick up every random idea that doesn't have an explanation and run with it and make it your new worldview. That would be irresponsible. And that would be the same type of naive arrogance and overzealous attitude that gets us in trouble. There's an approach to the world that I find can come from these ideas that's one of curiosity, respect for what you don't understand, and appreciation for the fact that you get to live as a being that has just a smidgen of enough of a capacity to engage and try to understand. That's what it all comes down to, honestly, is that we're trying to understand. And I think if you keep that can be the tether when you engage with ideas that seem overwhelming and mysterious and outside the realm of what is accepted, is that we're just trying to understand. And I think honestly that so much of our culture and our society and us as individuals would be better if we dropped the arrogant and angry certainty about everything and admitted that none of us know what we're doing. We're all trying to understand. At the very bottom of it, you should be admitting to yourself that what you want is to understand, not to impose what you know. There's very little that anyone knows because at the end of the day, we are all living for the first time. This is our first time doing a life. And so it requires a little bit of humility, you know? So when you engage with the unconscious, a little bit of humility and respect and curiosity. I think that's how you can microdose the void safely.